So before we start, my name is Luiz Quiroz, and I live here in Platteville. And for those of you who don't know me, I just absolutely love the history of music, history of sound recording, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of that stuff today. If you can't hear me, just yell at me. Speak up, yell. Just, yeah, scream at me. Anyway, so we get started over here, actually. We'll get to this here in a minute. Edouard Leon Scott de Martinville, a French inventor, actually came up with he was absolutely obsessed with recording the spoken word. And he came up with a phonautograph. He called it a phonautograph. It was this giant sort of funnel that fed into a bunch of membranes and needles and things that would actually record sound onto paper. So you could speak and you would see it on the paper. These recordings were never actually meant to be played back, and he never thought of it to himself. He always thought that he would be able to read it. He never really figured out how to read scribbles that big. But eventually his idea would sort of come to fruition in the form of a phonograph, which was in 1977. Thomas Edison actually came up with something very similar to this. This is the Edison phonograph. In 77, they would have been cylinders made of metal covered in tin foil that he would actually use a similar idea to Edouard Leon's idea to etch little lines onto a cylinder of paraffin or wax or tinfoil. This is what we ended up getting eventually. These came a long while after that. Alexander Graham Bell in the 1880s actually tried to improve on the original design by using wax cylinders. And to compete with these wax cylinders that weren't actually very durable or useful for a given amount of time, he used some of the first plastics ever invented to create this. So we will now listen to some of this. And this machine here is over 120 years old.
Wow.
Generously donated by Jean, what's Jean's last name?
Brown.
Jean Brown. And so I'll give it a couple cranks. And this would actually so just listen to a little bit of it. But anyways, these would actually run on a very simple concept. And when Edison was done perfecting the incandescent light bulb, he actually went ahead and perfected this to compete with Alexander Graham Bell's version. And this is that version. So we will take a look inside. And it's a very simple principle. You turn the crank, it sort of pressurizes a steel coil inside of this here, and all that potential energy is, with a simple gearbox, turned into kinetic energy, powers the entire thing. And these would actually be extremely expensive. Back then, common household income was maybe a couple $100s a week at most, and these things would run you over $200, $300, $600. Depending on which one you wanted. And the same is true for these. And now we'll move over to in the late 1800s, when a German inventor actually came up with the flat disc, which would later, this idea would later be picked up by the Victor Talking Machine Company, nowadays known as RCA Victor or Victrola. So these guys are actually the invention of a German man, and these ones in particular are called the Edison Diamond Discs. This was Edison's way of competing with RCA Victor, and we will actually listen to some of this as well. Got to crank it a lot. And before I go on, does anyone have any questions? No questions? Great!
So those are just run on by cranking them?
This is the same concept as this.
Okay.
It's just the steel coil.
Yeah.
You wrap it up a bunch of times in there, creates a ton of energy, and these could run for a while.
That great big tuba thing, was that part of that?
So, okay, that, there is if you look over there, there's like the phonograph horn sort of thing. This giant horn that would actually go on this. That one in particular, I don't think is for this machine, but it is a representation of it. The original ones would be a lot thinner and kind of like this. It would actually, this arm would move the entire horn with it, so it had to be real strong. Anyway.
So that way they could hear the music to dance to.
That's right, that's right.
Now, would that play like a whole, could you hear a whole song?
Yes.
With cranking it?
Depending on, these you could crank for a while, so you could get a ton of, songs out of this, but each one of these discs, I forgot to mention this, each one of these discs is one song per side. These would actually be the equivalent to the first 78s that ever existed.
Well, they're awful thick.
They are extremely thick, and these were actually made of ceramic. That's what Edison designed them out of. Ceramic. Vinyl didn't come around until the late 20s.
So it controls the speed of the...
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, 78 stands for 78 rotations per minute. So however many rotations around in this would do, the speed that you need to play it at for it to sound normal in your ear, instead of too fast or too slow. So we will listen to some of this.
But it controls the speed though, right? So it doesn't go
Yes.
slower or faster at the beginning and slower at the end?
You mean the machine itself, or? Yeah, it does.
As long as you have wound it enough to keep going.
Yes, it's kind of something like a gearbox mechanism. So, revs per minute, you won't go, you hit a wall, and then you have to change gear. This doesn't change gear, it just has one speed. It's kind of, these are actually, if you've ever watched some old horror movies,
Oh, yeah.
and you hear the music, it's kind of what these are. It's their whole deal. And it actually has an entire arm control that you can move around the arm, not just a little needle that you go, boop. But these, actually you could take this off, these didn't use needles at all. I could jab my finger there all day. That is not a needle, that's actually a piece of sapphire. And the
Sapphire.
yeah, a piece of sapphire. And
What
these
is
used
sapphire?
sapphire is a rock,
A gem.
a gem or a
Gem.
rock or something like that. These actually use the same thing. Again, I can bash my finger against that, I'm not getting poked. Yeah, they're actually pretty nifty, and
A lot of brass.
yes, a lot of brass, and actually quite expensive to make these. That's why they were so expensive to begin with.
Do you know what year that was made?
This one in particular would have been in the mid 1920s, because Edison really wanted his cylinders to work out, and he actually made these cylinders until 1929, when he finally had to give up the business, and Edison Records, the first record company, had to shut down. So, and if you actually want to take a closer look at that, you can here in a minute. But these are actually really nifty little things. The pinstriping and all of this. Edison even put his face on them. But these are actually really nice little time capsules. But anyway, we'll move on to the RCA Victor actually released the this as a sort of a competition with Edison Records, and to sort of put the nail in the coffin for poor old Edison over here. He actually, he went out of business in 29, and Columbia Records released the LP vinyl discs, the long playing vinyl discs, which came first. These are not LPs, by the way. This is a 78.
So,
The LP long playing vinyl disc, which could play multiple songs on each side. Up until then, that was pretty much impossible. You couldn't do that. They released that in 1948.
Oh, wow.
And then in 1949, RCA, to compete with the long-playing Columbia record, actually released the single, or the 45. These were perfect, and they were small. They were a lot smaller than the older 78s that had been released after the Diamond discs. These were just way too big, and they're a lot heavier than the 45. And so people wanted the flatter, nicer version if they wanted to play one song per side. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Any questions so far, anybody?
Now that one is only about half as thick as the other one was, huh?
This one?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, this one is only about a quarter as thick as a Diamond disc.
Oh, okay.
And then the 45 is also just way thinner than this as well.
Yeah.
So these, I can play a little bit of this if you like. Play a little bit of this.
I still have a few of those 45s.
I do too, somewhat. And 78s.
And this 45 in particular is also about 100 years old. And of course we have Prince. You gotta have Prince.
Oh.
Bing Crosby.
Yes. But anyway, yeah, love Bing Crosby, right?
Is that yours or is that the museum?
This one in particular is the museum's.
Oh.
This one was originally, I think it was actually inside of that Wurlitzer over there. That Wurlitzer came around in the late 40s.
So did that machine do the 78, the 45, and the...
This
And
this
the
is my own
33s?
personal record
Oh,
player.
so
this
that's yours.
This is a modern record player.
Yeah.
We won't be talking much about this because it's a modern one.
Oh, it's modern.
And
Okay.
which puts me on a different topic. The what I was talking about before about the price of some of these older models and even some of the Victrolas of its time. Inflation hasn't affected the record player. If you look at some of these record players from the 20s, from even the 10s, they were anywhere from $100 to $600 depending on what you wanted. That's almost the same today, if not cheaper. I bought this. This is a fine piece of equipment that works just fine. It was less than $50. And back then, people weren't making nearly as much money as they are today. And so what I'm saying is, the vinyl industry has not been affected by inflation. It really hasn't. But we will move on from the sort of the disc era, as I like to call it, and we will go to what I call the tape era. So, the tape. The first one that was actually used in home use or even in vehicle use was the 8-track tape. Before this, there were plenty of reel-to-reel systems that people had. They weren't really home use though. Most of it was commercial use. People would put movies on them. They'd play, entire films off of just tape. And these ones were the first ones that you could get your hands on that didn't require this ginormous piece of equipment. Radio stations, everybody used tape at this point. These ones were kind of a bygone era of the tape. These aren't, the 8-track tape was not really, it didn't take off very much. It was mostly just used in in vehicles, pretty much. And I'm sure most of you have used them in your cars in the past. But moving on from them, let's see, what year are we in? Sometimes I forget the year, that's the hardest part. In 1968, Philips, a team of inventors at Philips, actually invented what we now know as the modern compact cassette tape. So the modern compact cassette tape can be used in cars. It can be used, out on different adventures that you might have. You can carry them around with you. It was the most compact way that anyone had ever seen the transportation of music, of recorded music. So we went from, these, it's kind of funky, and you need this entire thing here to put that in, or you need something like this. There was no real portable music. You can't bring this whole thing with you and listen to it on the go. You can't plug it in your car. It's, some people did have vinyl record players in their cars. It was kind of shaky because you would go, you would go over a bump and there goes your record.
Yeah.
Boom, done. There goes your record. So these were much simpler, much easier, and they were quite durable. People would run over these with their cars to prove how durable they were. I've done it, it works, they're fine. I have done it. And so we come to 1979, the tape has ruled the school for about 10 years now, and we find that the CEO of Sony wants something portable, really portable, because before it was something like this. And so they make a deal with Philips. Can we use the licensing? Can we use these tapes to make a machine that takes these tapes that is really, really portable, that anyone can just grab it and go? It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be, this big. It doesn't have to have giant batteries that are really heavy. And Philips says yes, and Sony says, well, we were not going to pay you anything to use your tape. We're not going to pay you. And then we'll say, well, all right, go ahead, do what you will. And that kind of starts what I call the cassette wars. And that opens the door for just about anyone, any company, from General Electric to Sanyo to Sony to anyone, to just go out and make their own plastic junk to throw a cassette tape into. And that's kind of where this guy comes from. This is a Panasonic. So even Panasonic had their finger in that pie, and they really wanted to just capitalize on the success of cassette tapes. So the first and smallest available at the time of 1979 was this little guy, the Sony Walkman. And this is the first one that they ever made. The CEO of Sony would actually fly on his private jet and with this giant cassette tape player, something that would record music, something that, would do whatever he needed, but it was too big for him. He said, it's too big, I have to carry it around, this is ridiculous. So he commissioned the design of the Sony Walkman, and that's where the first ones came from. They first went on sale in Japan, and they were huge success in the US as well. You'll see them a lot everywhere. These ones were made of metal. Eventually they started making them out of plastic and cheaper materials, but for the first maybe 10 years, they were a huge success. Okay, now we're out of the sort of tape era, as I like to call it, and we go into the digital era, the final era, where we are coming to a close, as it were. The CD. In 1991, the CD kind of took off. They were invented in 1982, but nobody quite used them in the US until the 90s. They were very popular in Japan in the 80s. And eventually they took over and digital media became the standard. and people were so impressed with the style of them. They looked very futuristic. People were very sold on that. And just the portability. You could have so many. They weren't quite so thick as the tape. You know, it was a lot of things. Any questions, anybody? All right. And finally, we have the digital MP3 player, or the iPod. So in 2001, Steve Jobs announced the iPod. It used a smaller sort of computer in them to store and play back music. They got even smaller. So you
I have one of those.
Yep, this is an iPod shuffle. So you go from this thing, that would be the one of the few ways you could play music in its day, and then you go to that. So it's kind of a big step. It's a long way. And even the shorter steps from this to this is massive. I mean, just ridiculous. So the way that we listen to music was just absolutely blown out of proportion in such small packages and quality packages that it's kind of perplexing. So do we have any questions? Anybody?